We also have James Martel, who is the author of Anarchist Prophets. Terrific book, and the Benjaminian reading of utopianism, politics, and different visions of the alternative visions of the future and the present. So, terrific book. And my goal is to put James and Gary in conversation. So we will organize, I organize the talk or today's meeting in this way. I will say just a couple of things, no more than 6-7 minutes, I promise. And then I give the floor to Gary Wilder, who is, by the way, Professor of Anthropology at the Graduate Center, CUNY, New York, and he's the author of Concrete Utopianism and the author of Freedom Time, Negritude, Decolonization, and the Future of the World, 2015. He is also the director of the Committee on Globalization and Social Change, and is a terrific group. I was there several times. Yeah. I began 12 years ago, and then I went back to that terrific conversation whenever I could. And then, as I say, I would give the floor to James, and he has some critical remarks on Gary's book, and Gary will reply. And then we open the conversation to the audience. Let me say just a few things, as I say, 6 minutes, 7 minutes maximum on Gary's, something on Gary's book. And I want to start from the very end. This is on page 189. Just in order to please my narcissism, because Gary writes, the point of this kind of inquiries, one that is, of a concrete utopianism, the point of this kind of inquiries pursued by Tumba, Christine Ross, and me is not simply to understand how historical actors may have recruited past hopes for present needs, or attempt to liberate the futures condensed within persisting remnants of what has been. These critical operations are meant to intervene into our now. So I would say, maybe with a slightly critical accent, that many people are working on temporalities, and they are working on the way we can pluralize times. But I think what is the characteristic of this book, and maybe even the characteristic of this trio, also Gary Wilder and Tumba, is the intervention into our now. So what does it mean? I will say a couple of things, maybe more than 2. It means that when we talk about time, we take seriously the presence and the importance of what is called empty homogeneous time. We do believe that empty homogeneous time is real and has a real implication. Empty homogeneous time is what Marx would have called socially necessary labor time. From the point of view of the state, empty homogeneous time is the time of the state that synchronizes different temporalities. So it's how synchronization works. Intervention into our now in Gary Wilder's account means that he thinks that humanity is not an end to realize. Humanity concerns different configurations of the social and the political, different configurations of the present. So this is how Gary Wilder thinks that a new form or a new politics for the left has to be thought as a form of intervention into new configurations, or in order to create room for new configurations. Now the question is, what is a configuration? Maybe a question I want to ask again. I would say that we can find in the book different definitions of a configuration, but configuration is a term that I add to the conversation. It's not part of Gary's terminology. I would say that a configuration is the possible impossible, if we want to cite the verb. Is the possible impossible that is already present. A configuration is also the revolutionary poetry from the future, if we want to cite Marx. Configuration is also the time of the awakening, if we want to use Walter Benjamin. Awakening means that we live in a dream. What is a dream? So awakening is awakening from sleep and from a dream. What is a dream in our political conjunction? I would say, and I follow Gary Wilder's book, dream, sleeping, is the sense of being stuck in the present. So awakening is a way to break this sense of stuckness. Now, let's say the parts constraints of the book. There is a bigger parts destruence. There is a lot of criticism of what the left, the intellectual left, and the ontological discourse, and black pessimism. And there is a lot of deconstructions of all these discourses. But it's a deconstruction that comes together with the past constraints, with an attempt to give us a different theoretical political orientation. So a configuration, I would say, is also something that discloses orientation. And this is an orientation that can emerge. This is not in the book. I cite Christine Ross. It is a part of the trio. So we have a piano, bass, and drum. And Christine Ross writes that this new orientation can emerge from possible conjunctions between traditional and modern structures. So we have the way we start thinking about different times, how past and present can be recombined, reconfigured. So if we want to free the present, or if we want to get unstuck and open up a new possible futures, we also have, or we need, to liberate the past from the dictatorship of a unilinear time and synchronization, from the dictatorship of what we have called anti-homogeneous time. That is a real thing. It works in the global market, it works in the state, it works in the legal system. It's real. Yeah. We can talk about that. I'm going to end my short introduction. At the very end of the book, 3 pages before the last page, Gary cites Fernando Corone. He's an anthropologist from Venezuela, and I think he was also a colleague at the Graduate Center. And Corone writes, the left has no map, but it has a compass. I think, and this is another kind of a question or something that I want to put on the table, I think that what happened in the last I don't know exactly, 20, 30 years. I think that the left has also left the compass. We don't even have a compass. So we are trying to do politics without the map and without the compass. Gary tries to provide a compass, or at least to think together with many different authors, political thinkers. He tries to think what a compass looks like. I have only one example. There are many in the books. And I jumped from the last page where Gary cites colonial. I jumped to the first page, page 7, where Gary cites Du Bois. And I wonder, it's the one I think it's wrong book. It's from Dark Water. All men are brothers, writes Du Bois. And then he calls for the human God to make humanity divine. So I think it's already a courageous move to reclaim humanity, to reclaim brotherhood, to reclaim the divinity of humanity. A courageous move that I totally share with Gary Wilder, by the way. And the meaning is that this is my interpretation, and this is how I read Gary, that brotherhood is not an ontological condition, a situation. It's not an essentialist definition. Doesn't have anything to do with the biological commonality. Brotherhood is a political question. It's how we should change the social and political present order so that we can live as brothers. And being brothers also means that we are not just friends. Being friends is a very easy thing, because being friends means that you can choose your friends. And you can choose your friends, and you can choose your enemies, and you can exclude people you don't like and you consider not friends. Basically, you have a Carl Schmitt, and you have the friends enemy opposition. Brotherhood is a way to break the Carl Schmitt binary friend enemy. We live in the same planet, we share the same planet, and we have to find a way to live together with the people we haven't chosen. But it happened that we are together. I think it is living together in a just way that requires the transformation of a social and political condition, situation, or social political present. This transformation, this attempt of living together in a just way is just another definition of what a compass can look like. This is myself. This is how I read part of the book. And then I'm done. So Gary, and then James, and then Gary.
Should I sit here? I don't know how this is working.
Can you see Gary from? Yeah, you should see.
No, Max, if you can.
Go there?
Yeah, I think.
Okay.
Okay, wow.
Okay. Tell me how this goes. Oh, look, my friend is waiting here for me. Writing something on texting. Is this good? Can you see me?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, fantastic. It's so nice to be back here at UC Santa Cruz. Thank you, Max. Thank you, Banu. Thank you, HistCon, for inviting me. Thank you, Sadie. Max and I have been in dialogue for many years, and it's a treat for this to continue. And it's a treat to have James in the conversation, who I've also been in conversation with, but not explicitly about this. So I'm just, since you guys haven't read the book, and this is, always an odd thing, I'm just going to say maybe 10 minutes, maybe I think it's 11 minutes now it's 11 minutes and 38 seconds. 11 minutes on the big project, which there's a lot of moving parts in this thing, and it's not really summarizable, but I'm going to tell one kind of story about the book. One way to begin is to say I have, as Max was suggesting, a very simple starting point motivating this book. There is only one world marked by entanglement, interdependence, and asymmetry. Capitalism is a worldwide form of self-annihilating domination that requires worldwide responses. Kind of painfully simple proposition. Whether we think of climate change, financial instability, social inequality, mass displacement, neo-fascist authoritarianism, or any number of other issues, the global present is clearly characterized by intersecting translocal crises that I believe require translocal vision, organization, and institutional forms, even though what the form those forms should assume are not self-evident. So a repeating refrain runs through the book. A left politics adequate to our world historical conjuncture needs to be oriented towards fundamental societal transformation. Its aim should be new forms of collective self-management that would foster human flourishing. A. B, to be effective, both the means and ends of such emancipatory projects need to be translocal. They need to fashion transversal relations and formations that cut across seemingly self-evident boundaries between regions, cultures, ideologies, etc. C, such new worlds presuppose and create a new nomos of the world, a different worldwide order, as Lenin and Trotsky, who happens to be here, as Lenin and Trotsky warned, socialism in one country is impossible. I also argue that such efforts require political vision or practices of political imagination that refuse both epistemological and political realism. This means being attuned to how alternative possibilities may already dwell within or emerge from within existing arrangements. It may also require capacity, as Marx instructed, to draw our radical poetry from the future. Conversely, it may mean recognizing and reactivating untimely traces of other forms of life that may persist or repeat within a non-synchronous present or now. Each of these operations refuses to conflate immediate appearances with the really real or the given with the possible. Each requires us to unthink supposedly self-evident boundaries between here and there, us and them, now and then. So this is the work of what I call in the book concrete utopianism, whereas abstract utopianism engages in ungrounded speculation about perfect societies. Concrete utopianism identifies concrete links between existing arrangements and other possible worlds. It traces actually existing pathways to the supposedly impossible. Concrete utopianism is also about concrete action. It's about circumscribed demands that are not implausible under given arrangements, but whose logic and implications, if followed far enough, are incompatible with the existing order, may indeed explode the existing order. This, for example, is how I understand Ruthie Gilmore's idea of non-reformist reforms. I think she takes it up from Andre Gortz, but she uses it in a really nice way. We might think here prison abolition, of the elimination of fossil fuels, of global South debt cancellation, reparations for slavery, and any number of concrete demands that are not implausible, but whose logic, if followed, would really be incompatible with existing structures and logics. It is not then, So this formulation, concrete utopianism, there was some argument with friends and the editor, concrete utopia, concrete utopias, concrete utopianism. Everyone thinks pluralizing is going to solve all these kinds of problems. I chose concrete utopianism in order to emphasize that this is a political epistemological orientation, a way of seeing and knowing that stands in a mutually reinforcing relationship with experimental practices. Utopianism also emphasizes that I am not talking about static plans or ready-made blueprints. This is not about transhistorical normative models. As Fernando Corneille reminds us, the left has no map, but it does have a compass. See, Max, we're thinking in aligned ways. I thus link concrete utopianism to Marxian immanent critique. That is to say, identifying within a given phenomenon aspects that point beyond its actually existing form. But I also link concrete utopianism to what Aimé Césaire calls poetic knowledge, a capacity to recognize how phenomena may be more than or other than they appear to be, precisely because of what they happen to be. Concrete utopianism is what Henri Lefebvre calls the possible impossible. It entails a politics of anticipation, a calling for that is also a calling forth, a prefigurative acting as if. But here's the paradox that's also animating the argument of the book. If our global conjuncture, if you agree with any of what I've said, calls for this kind of political orientation, 50 years of neoliberal counter-revolution converging with 40 to 50 years of a certain kind of influential critical theory has undermined our affinity with and capacity for this kind of intellectual and political work. We've lost the habit of thinking about societal transformation, about thinking of political imagination, of thinking about other worlds. So this is the perspective from which I critique what I call left culturalism, left presentism, and left realism. By left culturalism automatically figures cultural difference as the primary and self-evident axis of political antagonism. It treats the fact of cultural singularity and incommensurability as proof of untranslatability, proof that there is no prospect of forging political alignments across evident differences. Left presentism treats the given order as unsurpassable, whether implicitly or explicitly. It insists that future-oriented political projects necessarily entail an outmoded or Eurocentric belief in linear temporality, progressive history, and teleological certainty. Such presentism, I suggest, tends towards melancholic fatalism and metaphysical pessimism. Left realism treats the immediately given as the really real. It regards actual historical development as the horizon of political possibility. Therefore, it dismisses attempts to envision, anticipate, or pursue other possible worlds as dangerously naive, optimistic, idealist, or even elitist somehow. Left realists deploy utopian and romantic as terms of abuse. So these are only heuristic distinctions. Typically, strands of culturalism, presentism, and realism are woven together to form a theoretical orientation and political position, or some variant of such a position that should be familiar to most of us. We need to wake up and grow up to the fact that societal transformation is unrealistic and impossible. Political imagination is just more liberal idealism. Solidarity politics necessarily reproduce cultural and racial divisions and hierarchies. Marxism is simply the Eurocentric flip side of liberalism, just another form of Enlightenment universalism that cannot grasp race, colonial domination, or non-Western historical situations. Such criticism typically reduces Marxism to an economic determinism that posits a stagist theory of progressive historical development. A lot of strawmanism in there. It insists that the self-evident way to confront Eurocentric racial and colonial domination is through a critique of universalism or an embrace of non-Western epistemologies and cosmologies, as if some categorical outside exists from which to challenge modern forms of domination. If nothing else, running through this book is the insistence that there is no outside. Such thinking retreats into analytically dubious and politically limiting binaries and false choices, universalism versus particularism, the West versus the global South, status nationalism versus liberal internationalism, as if these are the only alternatives. Such thinking offers us self-identical notions of here, now, and us, provincial notions of place, punctual notions of time, and identitarian notions of political subjectivity. Such thinking mistakes poetic vision with prescriptive blueprints. Utopianism is conflated with idealism, romanticism with conservatism, pessimism with radicalism, and Marxism with liberalism, as I suggested. Such thinking typically restricts itself to negative critique and does not risk envisioning or anticipating the kinds of worlds for which we might want to struggle. I suggest, probably more than once in the book, that there's a perverse complicity between such fatalist criticism and neoliberal triumphalism. Both make anti-political assertions about the end of history, about being stranded in the present. Ironically, however, the right wing in and beyond the US has indeed pursued a 50-year hegemonic project. Inspired by left-wing counter-systemic movements of the 1960s, it envisioned fundamental societal transformation. It has employed utopian political imagination and has pursued a politics of the possible, impossible quite successfully. As we know, the right has offered powerful visions of the world it wishes to see. It has mobilized broad coalitions across evident differences. We have seen the supposedly impossible become everyday reality. So enough with this. Let's be done with the politics of the possible impossible. So this is the perspective from which I call for left thinking to pay renewed attention to solidarity and temporality, to critical internationalism and concrete utopianism, to dialectical reversals and aesthetic politics, to Marxian immanent critique and Black radical poetic knowledge. This is why I am so taken by Lenin's revolutionary call to transform the imperial war into a civil war, which I take to mean that in any given situation, the crucial axes of political division are not self-evident. They cannot be known a priori. They must be discovered and constructed. This is why I want us to recall Samir Amin's bold call for a new internationalism of peoples, indeed his call for a new fifth international. This is why I emphasize that the dangers and difficulties of cultural translation and political solidarity should be the starting point for risky and messy and unavoidable experiments rather than preemptive reasons to retreat from the challenge. And this is why I am so interested in tracing affinities and intersections between heterodox Marxism and Black radicalism, one modest exercise in translation in order to forge generative connections across evident differences. And this is why throughout the book, I emphasize that these traditions have left us a legacy. The traditions of heterodox Marxism, Black radicalism, a certain current of Black radicalism, have left us a legacy of radical forms of universalism that are neither liberal nor abstract, forms of emancipatory universalism that have become largely illegible to so many currents of critical thinking today. Throughout this book, I engage critically with thinkers whom I hold in high regard about the aim of critique, about political orientation, and about the relationship between politics, history, and time. I'd add here about the relationship between aesthetics and politics also. So many of these thinkers pose crucial questions and offer powerful and persuasive critiques of liberalism, but I find myself frustrated by their anti-political conclusions. At a moment when the old warning about an existential choice between socialism or barbarism has never seemed so stark. And part of my point is just because the prospect of this socialism is so remote, that does not make the stakes any less high or the struggle any less imperative. Thanks. That's my role.
Yes, James Martel.
Tough act to follow. As someone who has had a long and complicated relationship to the concept of utopianism, I found Gary's book really helpful. I think Gary does a really good job of explaining why we should be talking about utopianism at all, which isn't always evident. Rather than thinking of it as a kind of romantic, dreamy waste of time, Gary convinces that we need to think about utopias precisely because it introduces the element of something that is not possible, not necessarily even conceivable, so long as we remain bound within certain articulations of thinking that may not announce themselves as such. I think this is one of the great strengths of his book, to clearly delineate some paths or thoughtways that not just liberals, but leftists too engage in that closes them to the idea of utopianism, even as it also precludes the kinds of changes that would render such thought closed, and even worse, unaware of its closure. The argument then is that the very elements that render the concept of utopia suspect, its disconnection from reality, its imaginativeness, its phantasmic aspects, are precisely those things that are required in order to transcend the traps and limitations of liberalism, traps that leftists fall into as well. But clearly this alone is not enough to prevent utopianism from being just a kind of ornament for liberalism itself. That's where the idea of the concrete comes in, and this is what I would like to focus on, what I say. The concrete for Gary is both a kind of pinning down, a holding of utopianism to account, so that it is rooted in actual practices and tactics, but it is also, and this is the part I really am interested in, an engagement with the foundations of what forms of our ideas of reality, so that in a sense, we become architects of our own sense of reality rather than merely consumers of it. One example of this can be seen in our idea of time. This is something that all of us share. I'm squeezing myself into your trio. Yeah, sorry. For Gary, there's a kind of bad presentism he was just talking about in contemporary thinking, including among purported leftists, which is itself really just a form of despair, part of that left melancholia that Walter Benjamin wrote about in his time, with updates, as Gary tells us in his book, by Stuart Hall and Wendy Brown, probably going to be, and Gary. Presentism in this reading seems to accept a catastrophic loss of time in history, something that Gary shows very nicely, for example, in his analysis of David Scott's book on the Revolution in Grenada, Omens of Adversity. The sense of being trapped in some hellish present that never changes, where revolution can only happen in the past, is a kind of metaphysical barrier for any attempt to realistically change the fundamental structures of the modern world. Benjamin himself said that whereas capitalism seeks to give us a sense of breathlessly plunging ever forward into the future, always moving towards the new and unprecedented, in fact, it reflects more accurately the stasis of hell. Nothing ever changes, or at least nothing is meant to change. The possibility of change has been transferred from human agents to time itself, so that all of our hope seems to lie merely in the fact that time moves forward. Benjamin tells us that the sense of progress made manifest, for example, in an institution like fashion, where each season brings a new look and a new style, is a disguise for that changelessness, and it brings on this kind of despair. In this sense, the concrete utopianism that Gary is talking about involves ways of looking, even at our own time, as if with different eyes. And the metaphor of Benjamin's awakening that he mentioned, or that Max mentioned, is very important here. The past, present, and future are all points in time that can readily lend themselves to reactionary modalities. The notion of concrete utopianism, I would say, does not live only in one of these temporalities, but in a sense reconsiders all of them. I really appreciated Gary's reading of Benjamin in this regard, and in particular his insistence that Benjamin is not simply, quote, a backward-looking pessimist, unquote. It's true that Benjamin says in On the Concept of History that we should look not to future generations, but rather to past ones for redemption. And it is also true that he says that, quote, even the dead will not be safe if the enemy is victorious, and the enemy is always victorious. Definitely sounds like a backward-looking pessimist. This doesn't. Or a melancholic too. But it is here that you can see how the idea of concrete utopianism works, because in fact, Benjamin looks backwards in order to look forwards. That is, Benjamin seeks to allow the unrealized dreams of the past to come to fruition in the now, no longer impossibly distant future. The past, because it existed, because it has a material record and a history that is accessible, gives substance and granularity to the future, which is otherwise for Benjamin utterly void. And as we were saying earlier, he calls it the liberal conception of the future, empty, homogeneous time. Here, the two temporalities, and this of past and future, and of course the present as well, serve to render one another uncanny, as Gary, taking the phrase from Freud, describes it. The uncanny is something that looks familiar, but is not. It is for Gary the way that we can steal back our sense of time, space, and reality from capitalism itself. As an aside, I should say that rather than focusing on capitalism in my own work, I tend to speak of archism, which is a form of political and economic organization based on hierarchy and domination, and which is so ubiquitous in our own time that it doesn't have or want to have a name usually. Its key elements are capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, the sovereign state, and these are all features of this overarching system. And in this system, not just human subjects, but even space and time themselves are hierarchical, ranked, and ordered, producing our current and ongoing political and economic catastrophe. And I found your book worked with archism very well. But whether we speak of capitalism or archism or what have you, What is critical here is that it creates traps of identity and context which appear to be utterly familiar, even natural, but which are in fact distortions of the building blocks of our sense of reality. Rendering these things uncanny then, such as Benjamin does with our sense of time, allows us to respond to our context and to one another in ways that are not predetermined and preordained. Going back to the idea that we can become agents of our own reality rather than consumers of it. I don't read this book as a tale of false consciousness that can be reappropriated by an encounter with reality itself. I think instead this is a claim that reality itself is up for grabs, a work in progress, but that up for grabs quality is not literally a free-for-all. It requires substance. It requires the concrete in order to be able to avoid only being more gaslighting and phantasm. I'm interested in whether this book would have been much different if it was called Material instead of Concrete Utopianism. I suspect that it would. I think that title might have left out something important, which is the idea that the concrete is once again as much about the physical as it is about the metaphysical. And I'm thinking of Heidegger's claim that concrete means concrescere, to grow together. Concreteness here is not something necessarily literal, but rather, once again, a kind of granularity that comes from re-encountering one's own position in the world as if for the first time, as if awakening from a dream. In a way, I hope you don't think this is bad. I think this is a compliment. Gary's work reminds me of the reaction against difference feminism that dominated in the 1980s. The claim there was that difference feminism, which espoused women as having certain qualities that distinguish them from men, caring, nurturing, and so forth, were in effect giving up on a lot of things that helped the men to dominate them. To ascribe these qualities to men alone meant that women, this claim went, were giving up some of the vital resources that are necessary for political power. For Gary, too, many leftists write off entire areas of politics that he argues are necessary for radical change to ever be possible again. You can see this perhaps most clearly in his critique in chapter 2 of certain left thinkers like Frank Wilderson and Partha Chatterjee. There was a certain perverse joy that I had in reading all these people I really love and admire and seeing this kind of critique. It was very, in both cases, he tells us that these thinkers reject large swaths of politics. Wilderson and Jared Sexton, his fellow Afro-pessimist, reject the concept of the political we out of hand and see anti-Blackness as the basis and even the suture for the modern world. Chatterjee sees internationalism as hopelessly tied up with Western globalism. By giving up these critical concepts, that is to say the we and internationalism, Gary is telling us we're also giving up on real power and real change. The thing to do is not to abandon these concepts or write them off as utterly connected to liberalism, capitalism, archism, or what have you, but to reappropriate them in line with the principles of concrete utopianism. So, and here I'm going to sort of make a critical intervention, which is thinking with you. But it struck me that this book would be a good opportunity to try to work out in its own theoretical practice the kind of real world moves that the author urges on us. In other words, can there be some kind of reconciliation between those on the left who engage in the problematical modes of thinking that Gary is concerned with, and those who are more open to concrete utopianism? The book does a very convincing job of putting people in either camp, and it is very clear about why and how it makes this discernment. But I was thinking that for concrete utopianism to truly succeed, it has to appeal to more than one particular group of leftists. If the kind of radical internationalism that the book looks for, an idea that I find very appealing, a fifth international, to cite Samir Amin again, how can these divisions be reconfigured so they're not further internal divisions of the left ad nauseum? Gary does some of this work already in that he acknowledges both the positives in these leftist thinkers, and I'm with him on abandoning all the liberals, like forget them, as well as the context and reasoning that led them to their own belief structures. I mean, I think it's a sincere move. It's not just a kind of by the way. But I also see a way to think about even those distinctions that lead to presentism, melancholia, and the rest in ways that are dialectical rather than adversarial. That is to say, if we accept, for example, the Afro-pessimist's deep distrust, which is a huge understatement, of ever speaking of a we, is there a way to think of political action that works with and from that distrust rather than trying to bridge it? I think this is a very basic and critical question for Gary's project. His version of internationalism is so fundamental and it seemingly requires a we, or does it? One of my favorite sections of this book was Gary's excellent discussion of Marx's notion of what communism would look like, a society of associated producers. This is a bottom-up rather than a top-down way of associating, and in so doing, it preserves a radical unlikeness rather than presupposing a common likeness that leads to ordinary understandings of a we. So in other words, I think what this book really does is it shows you what a bottom-up form of relationality looks like as opposed to a top-down form of relation. We're so used to the top down. We already know what relation, we already know what the we is, then we just squish it on everyone. But what if the we came out of the ground, if you see what I mean? It's a very different model. And I think a lot of the critiques of the leftists in this book, or his critiques of leftists in the books, might be able to sort of work with this other form of relationality that he comes up with. This is just one example of how we can expand upon and think within this project in ways that takes its basic core concept very seriously. Another way that this might be done is to think about the notion of translation that Gary offers. Here too, he shows a lot of connections with Benjamin's understanding of translation, wherein the act of translating transforms not only our understanding of terms in the new language, but also in terms of the so-called original language. Gary captures this dynamic really well when he reminds us that CLR James once declared that, quote, I love this, to Bolshevize America it is necessary to Americanize Bolshevism, unquote. In other words, as one object encounters another, whether it's phrases in two languages or political systems or individuals, both become changed. Both are rendered uncanny as themselves and are transformed in the process rather than one faithfully copying the other, which is again a bottom-up rather than a top-down mode of relationality. Benjamin's idea of translation actually serves to eliminate the sense that there is an origin at all. It undoes the inherent ranking of objects that comes with the very idea of an origin, so that nothing is before anything else, either temporally, physically, or metaphysically. And this, again, is why I think the concept of archism, which is all about that ranking, kind of comes into play here. I think this is precisely the space that concrete utopianism shows itself to be both most useful and most radical for. In my own parlance, I would say that this is a form of radical anarchism that seeks to undo the most basic building blocks of archism and denies any kind of preset hierarchy, any perspective wherein one can judge and rank in order. And here again, I wonder if we can incorporate not just the heroes of the book when it comes to translation, Diagne, Blisson, and Santos, from those who the book is more critical of, like Talal Asad and Walter Mignolo. The problem with those thinkers, once again, for Gary, is they're too ensconced in a kind of localism that denies the internationalism that he espouses. For example, he tells us that Mignolo, quote, insists that all the ways of knowing are bound up with particular ways of living. But, Gary goes on to say, he grounds this important insight in a reductive dictum, I am where I think. In so doing, he elevates himself into a basic epistemic principle, the very cultural and territorial ontology that allowed colonial power to racially define and rank peoples and regions, unquote. I don't want to make it sound like I'm saying something to the effect of why can't everyone just get along? I appreciate the care with which this book makes distinctions between thinkers, but I wonder if the kind of localism and difference that Mignolo and Assad are espousing isn't useful for concrete utopian politics after all. Although I might accept Mignolo, I don't think you can, I think his nationalism is too much for you, but some of the other thinkers at least. Going back to the Marxist vision of a society of associated producers, it seems that it offers an entirely different vision, once again, of what it means to be in relation to someone or something. The key point, perhaps, is that without the ranking and taxonomizing of difference, difference does not have to be reconciled. An appreciation or even a demand for difference doesn't have to be at odds with a kind of radical internationalism. In fact, it might even be a critical part of it, because without that difference in localism, how do we know that we are in relation in the first place? In other words, if the relation doesn't tell you what it is beforehand, you need the things, the parts that are in a relationship to tell you what they are in order to form that relationship. It seems to me, too, that in order to realize the concrete, it is precisely these disagreements and clashes that are stuff that make up the granularity for concreteness in the first place. And for a final thought, I want to leave you with a bit of localism of my own. At my university, San Francisco State, we have a proud tradition of having the longest student strike in US history. The strike in the late 60s was called the Third World Strike, a term that Gary pays a lot of attention to. And the strikers themselves were radical internationalists of the kind that this book definitely calls for. The strike led to the establishment of a Black Studies program at SF State, as well as the nation's first, and for a long time, only college dedicated to questions of race and politics. But to the dismay of the strikers, it was not called the Third World College as they intended, but rather the College of Ethnic Studies. To this day, and many of them are still alive and fierce as ever, they're all in their 80s, a lot of the strikers reject the notion of ethnic studies in favor of the concept of the third world. That distinction substitutes the kind of ethnographic determinism for what was in fact an attempt at a non-harmonious, radically unalike, and entirely unranked sense of collective non-collectivity. Although the term third world has become entirely pejorative today, it is not for these radical octogenarians. I think Gary's own attention to the concept of the third world, to a new spirit of Bandung that transcends the many problems of the original conference, is critically important, and it gives us a way to use old words in new forms, itself a manifestation of the concrete utopianism that he is after. We see in the story I've just told how readily that vision can become ensnared in false analogies and deadening connections. But by the same token, where Benjamin once again tells us that even the dead are not safe if the enemy is victorious, we can also see that even though something is in the past, that does not mean that it is inaccessible, lost to whatever determination it was meant to subject. And concrete utopianism is exactly what gives it the chance to come back into the present and change the world. All of time, Gary reminds us, is alive and present in some sense. And that means we will always have the resources to draw upon to rethink, re-experience, and reshape what was, is, and will be. The mere fact that there was once meant to be a third world college at San Francisco State means that a future third world college, and by extension a future third world more generally, will always be possible. So thank you.
I don't really want that. I'd rather be. Thank you, James. Holy shit. Yowza, that was beautiful. That was fantastic. A model of engagement and so much to think about in the first real public response I've had. So thank you. I feel like despite all kinds of convergences, divergences, agreements, disagreements, a lot of what I was saying came through. So thank you. I have a lot to think about. I'm not going to go through all of this, but let's start at the end there. I mean, it's such a wonderful point, not just a critical point, but kind of like taking my own claim seriously to say, so what's up with this categorical division between the good thinkers and the bad thinkers, between the people you celebrate and the people you criticize? Despite my own ethics and politics, agonism gets me out of bed and gets my pen to paper, and I don't know how to think in any other kind of way. And I think that's a really good point. But let me offer an explanation and a qualification while I take the point, and it will just have to, I don't have I take that as an invitation as I move forward and as I think and as I move. I do think part of the antagonism is a real frustration, as I said, with like the right has done this hegemonic project while the left has trained me. I also was in an argument all the way through with my own earlier self. I came up, these were my heroes that so many of them are the heroes who shape my own thinking. And then it's like, in a certain way, this is like Foucault has ruined everything for everybody, even though I was for a long time a very serious Foucauldian. So there's that kind of need for political judgment, as Samir Amin said, and need to say, hey, so much of this thinking is problematic, and I'm going to go there because it's much easier, I think. I think liberalism is low-lying fruit, which isn't to say I defend liberalism. I mean, we're always in rooms like this, kind of repeating familiar critiques of liberalism with which we all agree. And maybe that is a unifying principle that creates a certain kind of we, but I think it's harder. And this is the work of translation, the work of solidarity practices, the work of forging political transversal alignments is also about different. Now, my tone maybe should be different, but it is about difficult conversations within, we on the left, we critics, we enemies of liberalism. And I think these are important conversations to have, even though some of these people are my heroes. I try to deal with what you're saying a little bit by not just offering respectful critiques, but part of my method in at least the earlier chapters is to say, here's an important political question or a social theoretical question. Here are how some of our most important thinkers have put this crucial question on the table and have offered us extremely persuasive and forceful and indispensable critiques. But here is where they reach an impasse, in my opinion. No one has to agree with me. As I read it, political and analytic impasses, dead ends, limitations. And then it's not just me saying, hey, I don't like this, but let's go back to supposedly outmoded Marxists, some of them, and supposedly not outmoded, but I would say selectively read and understood aspects of Du Bois or Césaire or Glissant or different kinds of Black radical thinkers and to say, look, they start in that same place of insisting on locality and difference that you're talking about. So I want to make clear, I'm not taking locality or particularity or difference off the table. I'm saying, you're right, let's get out of the universalism versus particularism, or the general abstraction versus the concrete, embodied or lived or real or situated. And these are traditions of thinking that they insist as fiercely as any of these post-structuralists or post-colonial thinkers or decolonial thinkers or Afro-pessimists on the irreducibility and singularity of difference. And yet they have a different way of moving forward and moving towards the universal that is not about abstracting from differences to create this common we that is all linked, but about, for example, if we think about Glissant, relation as the open totality, as this kind of ramifying network and fabric of singularities that weave together. So that's my way of taking. So I don't think I'm not, that's a lot of negatives. I don't think I'm not taking seriously the insights of Chakrabarty and Assad and Mignolo and some of the people I criticize, Chatterjee, because I'm saying, yes, absolutely. That critique of liberal universalism is right on point. It's the ending point. It's the political conclusions. It's the implications that are so frustrating to me. It's part of why I use this untimely method, Max's anachronism, to go back to earlier traditions to say, hey, they frame the question in very similar ways, but they have a pathway forward that I think gets us out of, it doesn't solve everything. Obviously, these are real problems. So we're not going to think our way out of these problems. We can only act our way out of these problems. But they provide something like the compass that Max was talking about and Corneille was talking about. So, I do want to make clear, this is not, I don't want to reproduce the kind of anti-localism or, that's why Glissant is so beautiful and that dialectic of world and worlds. No one is more insistent on the very lived, situated, specific singular world of Martinique, and yet no one is more expansive in talking about, wandering as the site of assembly, or a world in which we wander and do not get lost, or this idea of building the Tower of Babel in every culture or every people. So maybe, and maybe we can open this up for conversation. Maybe there's an important distinction to be made between localism and provincialism. I am arguing against provincialism, but not difference or localism. Oh, this isn't in the book. You're inviting me to think, but maybe we need to think about non-provincial forms of localism, which is precisely what I think Du Bois and Glissant and Césaire and, so many of these thinkers and all those people kind of I line up at the end offer us. I love the idea of us just to kind of tag a few more things without, I won't go on, I'll stop. But I love the idea of being architects rather than consumers of reality. I think that's a beautiful formulation and extremely useful. And I'm glad all three of us agree on the importance of awakening. It's such a beautiful formulation, the way Benjamin talks about it, because it's not like, again, it's not false conscious. It's not like the dominant order has tricked you. Let's wake up to reality as it really is. What he's talking about is true awakening is to awake to the dreamlike character or the nightmarish hellscape, as you're talking about, of the waking world. So awakening is a kind of a disposition, an orientation, a way of seeing and knowing and possibly acting that cuts across the seemingly obvious division between waking and sleeping, and between the real and the imagined, between the visible and the invisible. So it's part of why awakening, like Césaire's poetic knowledge, is so useful to me. I look forward to reading your book and hearing more about archism. I see there are different ways to, how do we not reduce everything to, one move is to say, well, when I say capitalism, I'm not only talking about the economy. The other is to say, let's add a set of other things to capitalism, imperialism, the state, white supremacy. So I'm sympathetic and there with you. I like the invitation to think about the possible differences between material utopianism and concrete utopianism. I will think more about that and so much more. But thank you. That was beautiful. I'd rather open this up to conversation. Thanks, man.
Thank you, Gary. We have the need for questions and comments.
I don't know. Should I?
You can stay here.
Okay. I'm not going to go stand up.
Yeah, thanks. I really look forward to reading the book, and so maybe this isn't it, and it's just my fault for not having read it yet. But I wanted to ask a time question about duration. Alan Badiou, in several pieces he's written recently, and reflecting on efforts at utopia making, concrete utopia making over this, over the last sort of spate of politics is. One critique he's made is the absurd timescale. In other words, an absurdly short timescale, by which transformation is to be measured and in which transformation is to be accomplished, and calling for a kind of political activation based on this communist hypothesis calls for a reorientation of our concept, our political notion of duration, and saying that what's required is a revolution, a Neolithic revolution. And I think by the Neolithic order, he's talking about something similar to what James is by archism. And so, and I think, one of my issues with the kind of Benjaminian school of utopian possibility is precisely that durational question. It's kind of subitic, instantaneous flashing up of something. And then disappearing, and I wonder if you have reflections on the sort of place of duration in that.
I don't read Badiou, but in this case, and I think of him as this is interesting, is I think of him as this thinker of the event, which frustrates me or dissatisfies me in precisely the way you were saying he rightly questions that Benjaminian rupture. I don't have one idea, so I don't fetishize that moment of break and sudden, but I do like the idea of living, and not just living in this Derridian waiting without expectation, but acting as if every moment may be the narrow passageway through which revolutionary change might occur. But I completely agree with you. In my own thinking, I tend to bounce between an openness to that Benjaminian moment, which happens historically. And as you heard me talk about the right in the 50-year struggle, I'm also a Gramscian, the long, slow, hard road. And I think a question for all of us. So what I really believe and what's really, despite I love Benjamin in all kinds of ways that James and Max talked about, but the spirit of the book is much more like we need to do, this is messy, this is hard, this is difficult, this will be, but we need to do that a long, hard, undertake a long, hard hegemonic struggle. However, which is not in the book, climate change is a motherfucker. Climate change really does the left have the time for that 50-year, 80-year, because not only did the right take 50 years, but it's been so successful that, undoing that maybe, it would have taken 50 years if we started when they started to create socialism. Now we have to undo and create. So I think this question of left politics and timescale is extremely important. And I think we have, myself, I'm struggling with this, where my own convictions about a kind of Gramscian orientation leaves me in this moment of imminent catastrophe. On the other hand, it's not a comforting thought, but I think part of the problem, I'm shifting and ask about this, but I'll just add, part of the problem with this Anthropocene and climate change discourse, both in the academy, but especially in the public sphere, is this fantasy that it's also going to be a break. Here we are living our lives, and suddenly we're going to be in the woods, learning how to make fire again, rather than thinking about this, something like Marx's primitive accumulation, just in timescale, a 300-year process of horror that will continue to be horrible and horrible and horrible and horrible, that transition is going to be extremely long. So, we can't not undertake that work because we may not have the time we once had. There's still a lot of time and a lot of suffering. So, yes, about timescales, and yet I don't want to categorically take the Benjaminian rupture off the table, because things happen. We saw it with COVID. I mean, suddenly an unexpected thing happened, and it was like such an instructive moment of like, oh my God, like the world order can shift. Of course, it's got to be constant, but that sense of like the impossible, the unimaginable at any moment. Imagine there had been a 50-year left project that had been, not exactly successful, but an infrastructure when something like that happened. A Fifth International. Let's say there was 30 years of a Fifth International at that moment. Maybe, I don't know. So, great question. Long answer. I'll show. And these guys can.
I have a million questions. Very interesting. I have not yet read the book, so I am really curious to read it now. But there were several questions that came to my mind as I was listening to you and to James's very illuminating comments. I must say, I love the way you divided the tendencies of the left, the culturalism, the presentism, the realism. I kept thinking, which shortcomings do I fall into? Where do I guess I would probably find myself in the company of left realists or something like that. Yeah. But I don't know. I have to read how you characterize them. But I did wonder whether, I don't know if this is what you're arguing, that the commonality of these three currents in a certain way is precisely the opposition to concrete utopianism that you are suggesting. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how this opposition that you're presenting us with kind of brings all of those otherwise very different strands together in a certain way. Are you creating a new kind of not a straw man. I think you have a lot of complexity and many thinkers at play, but I think these kinds of conceptualizations can be really helpful to sort of orient oneself vis-a-vis a very complex territory that includes many currents of the left. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how this utopianism opposition brings very different, otherwise disparate strands together, and in what way? So that's one question I have. And the other question I had is the relationship of concrete utopianism to abstract utopianism. And for what is abstract utopianism for you? How do you characterize that? And what are the differences? You mentioned some of these, that it's prefigurative, that it's like actual practices and based on actual practices and tactics. You mentioned non-reformist reform, no blueprints, translocal. Like you gave us some clues, but I didn't get like concrete examples of concrete utopianism so much. So. Other than various thinkers kind of guiding that effort or ism. So if you could talk a little bit more about like the abstract versus the concrete strands in utopianism, I think that would be really helpful to me. And a final point, I was like looking at your book and I saw that it's really directed at more or less the contemporary conjuncture. And correct. I wondered what your relationship is to the historical tradition of utopia, starting all the way from the greatest utopian book ever, which I think is Plato's Republic, to Thomas More.
There you go again. 3 days we've been talking about Plato, the three of us, yes.
But these, you could see these books like Thomas More's Utopia, Francis Bacon, you could see these books as offering blueprints for an alternative society, or you could see these books as offering a trenchant critique of their contemporary society.
Right.
And I think, in that sense, I don't know if they fall into the abstract or the concrete. They provide pretty concrete, practical suggestions as to how to reorganize society in every aspect of social life. But I'm not sure if they're abstract in your book. So like that historical tradition, which also pluralizes, especially in modernity. I mean, you have the science fiction strand of this, you have the city planning strand of this. I mean, utopianism is a very complex tradition. So how do you situate yourself in relationship to that complicated history?
I miss you in New York, Baruch. Wonderful questions. Shall I? Yeah, okay, there's a lot here, but let me start at the end there. In terms of the historical tradition, I defer to James. I didn't, I don't know. I didn't do that research. I didn't do that thinking. And hopefully if this book sparks that conversation, I will learn from interlocutors. Just as a little backstory on the way books work and this strange book. And I did say this in the preface or something. I didn't set out to write a book on concrete utopianism. This book is totally different from any book I've read. One, because as you said, well, you didn't say this, but there isn't a kind of empirical object in the same way. My object is contemporary critical theoretical discourses and only certain currents of them. Obviously, there are a lot of political theorists and critical theorists and left thinkers who talk about other possible worlds, et cetera. But, I'm talking about very influential currents. But I didn't set out to write a book on concrete utopianism. I wrote these pieces and they all started to meld together and I realized I had a book. And for many years, the title of the book was Untimely History, Unholy Times on the Politics of Temporality and Solidarity. And much as I love my editor, Tom Lay at Fordham, and he's a wonderful guy, and I invite all of you guys to work with him. And he, for a mild-mannered guy, he's not uncunning, because it was precisely at the moment that he gave me the good news that the board accepted it, it's under contract, not online, it's done. It's like done. And we had a beer, we were, I don't know that we were high-fiving, but whatever the kind of nerdy academic version of, high-fiving. He's like, oh, by the way, that shitty title has to go. It's too wordy, no one knows what it means, and no one will remember it. And of course, I was in that moment, I was like, all right, so we started brainstorming quickly, and I didn't really like what was coming out. And then I said, concrete utopianism, like politics, like impossible, it could have been many things. I said, concrete utopianism is a motif that runs throughout. I keep coming back to that. It could have been for new internationalism. Who knows? It could have, it's just the title. So, and then it became concrete utopianism. But I actually, while utopian, that seems weird since that's the whole argument of the book, but it wasn't. I didn't. So if I set out to write a book about concrete utopianism, I know I probably would have had to deal or made myself deal with that whole historical tradition. And it was ex post facto. It was a rubric under which these kind of soundings, these interventions on temporality and solidarity in relation to current academic events and world events between 2008 and 2017-18 became gathered. And so, I don't know, and I didn't, it's almost a relief that I didn't do that because it would have been a longer book and probably a worse book, but I don't think it's an unimportant question. And I just haven't thought some of that stuff I haven't even read, some I have read. So I don't know. In terms of the concrete, there's a lot I can say about the concrete versus the abstract, but I might shorthand that by just talking about dialectics. Concrete utopianism is dialectical. It traces pathways between here and there, between the existent and the possible. Whereas abstract utopianism is ungrounded speculation. I'm not saying there's no place for ungrounded speculation. I'm not saying that ungrounded speculation might not find its way into what I'm calling concrete utopianism, but I insist on the concrete because it is not, so much of what seems impossible is not impossible. And it's not just, let's just imagine a perfect society or just fantasize about what we wish, but like, maybe we start with fantasies of what we wish, but part of the work is in practices and in conjunctural analysis, always tracing a possible, not a necessary, we don't have to be hopeful or optimistic about it, but a possible pathway between what is given and what could possibly be. And that's one way in which I would insist that the concrete is a useful qualifier there, that dialectical pathway. In terms of your first question, it is true, and I'm glad that came through even in the three of our conversations, that although there's always the risk of when you generalize, back to abstraction and content. We've been having a 3-day conversation about not this book, but these issues, but 2 days. I don't know, I'm adding on. See, concrete utopian thinking, more abundant time, more abundant life. I'm glad it's coming through that I'm finding it useful. I'm looking here, I should be looking. I think it's useful at certain moments. It is useful at different moments for analytic or political purposes, for a specific intervention, and maybe more or less useful to emphasize similarities and emphasize differences. In this book, I'm emphasizing similarities between a lot of the thinkers and the political orientations I find productive, and I'm insisting on that despite the differences, to say, look, I'm not erasing these differences, but look at this affinity between not just Black radicalism and Marxism, but Marxism and, I explicitly don't get into the anarchist argument because I think so much of my Marxism is, congruent with a certain spirit of anarchism and vice versa, and I want to get over those provincial, it's non-sectarian all the way through, but also there is, that maybe it's a Schmittian moment of, I do have this, that thinking is problematic, and I do group them together in a certain way. You guys have read it more recently, but I love that Mariátegui thing of saying, instead of thinking about reformist versus revolutionary Marxists, let's think about the difference between Marxists who believe in the imagination and who don't believe in the imagination. So part of what I think I'm doing, although I wasn't explicit about, I wish I had written it, but it's the fun of being done. There's the agony of being done, then there's the fun of being done, like rewriting it in your head. I think partly, this was my way of saying, rather than just saying liberals and anti-liberals, let's transform the imperial war into a civil war. And I am kind of constructing different kind of alignments. And there's a way in which Glisson is not the kind of Marxist I am or I am calling for. But I think someone like Glisson can help this kind of left internationalist project. There, oddly, he may be more aligned with the spirit of Samir Amin in certain ways than a lot of revolutionary anti-imperial nationalists who identify with Samir Amin and whose politics may be closer, but are not helpful in certain ways. So I'm kind of trying to do that Leninist thing of let's not, as I said in my comments, let's not assume that we know what the axis of differentiation is. It may be more useful in certain ways to construct different kinds of antagonisms in order to not in order to take them down, but to bring into relief certain limitations and possibilities. So that's my,
Can I add something which is sure, I'm just parodying you. But for your third question, in terms of just this question of
the historical tradition
of so books like Plato's Republic and Thomas More Utopia, I feel like they don't quite qualify as concrete utopianism precisely because they have so much detailed. This is how you can do it. Like in other words, that it sort of airs too much on the concrete, and in that way, it sort of presupposes sort of where it's going to go. You know what I mean? And I don't know if you agree with this. It's me parroting you. So, but utopian enough in a funny way.
Useful, and it does go to your point about the gathering of the people supporting and gathering the people I'm criticizing. Part of this intentional gathering, and I know it's a risk and it could irritate, we're theorists, we're thinkers, we're political actors, and we take differences seriously, and they really matter in all kinds of ways. And I deliberately, even on the left, Martin Negri and David Parfit, do not comport, do not like each other. But partly why I am doing that is to say, look, even though that last chapter, you haven't read it yet, it's called The World We Wish to See. I never in this book, I say anti-capitalism, anti-imperialism, anti-racism, we have to overcome alienation and, collective self-management. And, they're very general propositions in part to emphasize the aim of this book is not to lay out what should be done and what that society should look like, but to say, unless we are open to those kinds of practices and debates, we are lost. But 50 years of the theory I was trained in says, to do that is to, a vision is a blueprint is hierarchical, hierarchy is totalitarian, and suddenly we're all in proposed local politics, and let's just hope for a reversal. Yeah.
Key and then Jim.
Okay, thanks so much. I'm also very much looking forward to reading this. I also have a lot of questions, but something that really stood out to me is your reference to Ruth Wilson Gilmore, because I've been thinking about her sort of simple but far-reaching and now semi-famous line about how freedom is a place. And I think there's a lot there in terms of, most of my questions revolve around this question of the where of concrete utopianism. And I think this is sort of where Kristen Ross is going with a lot of her work on, social space and the commune form. But I'm wondering, and this is also, I think, what Lefebvre is trying to do with the possible impossible, right? Is trying to locate it somehow within everyday life, or within rhythm through some kind of rhythm analysis. So I wonder how space is working in your project. And I think addressing the spatial opens something like orientation to a whole new set of problems. Orientation obviously is literally a spatial category in many ways. And to deal with orientation is always to deal, I think, with the problem that Kant raised about how does thought orients itself. For Kant, in a lot of ways, the obverse of reason is not the irrational necessarily, but it's also how the body is oriented in space and the problem of direction, which Cassirer developed into a theory of myth, actually. So I wonder if this can get us to not only thinking about the concrete, but getting us to think about some of the dangers around what might be called the pseudo-concrete. This is what Kozik has a term for the pseudo-concrete and the dialectics of the concrete. It's, I think the question of the concrete is something Lefebvre taught us that is something that needs to be, I think you said this more or less, needs to be produced collectively. It's an open question. So I'm wondering what kinds of problems arise once we take spatiality into account here.
Tell me more about the pseudo-concrete.
The pseudo-concrete, as I understand it, is, every once in a while there's a call in a discipline to let's return to the concrete, right? Mm-hmm. I think the pseudo-concrete is often when it's taken as, you talked about it as lived experience, a sort of direct, immediate access to the concrete. Yeah.
sorry,
No,
I got you.
Yeah.
So this, I would say those kinds of calls, let's return to the concrete,
Yeah.
will line up much more with the realism that I'm
Right,
criticizing
right.
in a thoroughgoing way.
Right.
And a realist epistemology. This is not about, you know, factual evidence or, this is it's concrete utopianism. So it is a passionate call or forceful call for political imagination, for thinking in recognizing uncanniness and thinking in uncanny ways, for poetic politics and thinking about aesthetics as potentially politically generative, much more than non-imaginative and non-poetic politics that may have a better materialist objective or something. So that's definitely not what I'm talking about. Right? In terms of spatiality, I do think when I don't use the freedom is a place, and I'm not sure, I would want to hear more about that.
Sure.
But I do think I could have added to, like, when I was laying out the inventory of what I mean by concrete utopianism, that these, situatedness, and all of these thinkers I'm interested in, the Marxist and the Black radical thinkers, refuse this in, like, either abstract, placeless, idealist, alignments or practices, or just the concrete, local, particular, concrete utopianism, that peculiar conjuncture that maybe doesn't go together, is all about a link between situated actors in situated embodied actors in concrete struggles, and part of that struggle is always, as I said, about collective self-management. So I'm not anti-local, I'm not anti-popular sovereignty, I am not this is not about liberal internationalism, this is not about Kantian cosmopolitanism at all. It is about concrete place-based communities struggling for collective self-management. But in the world we live in now, whether it's archism or global capitalism, there are such severe limits to, just like the limits with Marinage all the way back. There are, it's beautiful and limited. So to me, the left political challenge in general and of our moment is to link practices and experiments and collective stuff, place-based in your language. I don't use, not geographer, and that's not like my main update, but place-based, situated. I do use situated a lot. Practices and experiments in collective self-management, and how to conjugate that, link that to translocal solidarity and translocal formations. Federalism is not the magic answer to everything, but there is a reason why so many of the thinkers and the movements I'm sympathetic to experiment with forms of federalism, because it's one of those ways to refuse the opposition between the planetary and the local or the place, So, I think Glisson is someone who, again, thinks a lot about place. So, do you want to say a little bit more about freedom as a place and what it means there?
I think part of what I'm getting at with that is, in terms of Lefebvre, let's say, I think Lefebvre is kind of resistant to this concept of scale. Like, he uses level instead of scale in a way that a lot of geographers have found very problematic. But I think it lends itself to your kind of project, to thinking about translocality in a way that's not just a scale.
Right.
It's not just one of many scales, but there's some kind of universality or something within the translocal that you can't just say, okay, we need the local and the national and the regional to all work together. There's something more interesting, I would say, or more dialectic going on. Freedom is a place. It's just people have taken it in many different ways, but I think it's sort of a challenge to sort of Lefebvrean challenge to like locate possibility in
actual
practice. Exactly.
Not in some kind of abstract
that's
theory of freedom
Yeah.
or a constitutional document that posits a set of rights or something.
Yeah, exactly. It's just more of a move
That's
to
helpful.
get to social practice. But that's what I was trying to say about the concrete, and I think you got at this, and it's that, you know, the concrete's not just an object out there, but it's something that we collectively construct and reconstruct through practices. And part of what really interests me in a lot of the work that's done on the space of practice is that it's not always transparent socially. And that, to me, that's sort of Lefebvre's project, like rhythm or everyday life is, or space to some extent, is inherently contradictory, and therefore it's a practice, it's a collective practice just in rendering that visible. So part of what I'm saying is trying to push this project towards thinking maybe a little bit about like the infrastructures of concrete utopianism. Like, what are the practices, you know, very tangibly and concretely that build towards this, and locating them already around us rather than, you know,
Well, if you do get to read it, you can send me a message
It's on my
and see, and let me know whether you think some of my discussion of translation might be one example of the infrastructure. I mean, I didn't take that up, and I think it's a great, you know, that too. This work begs that question, and I hope people will run with that. But maybe translation is one of the kind of infrastructural practices that might do this. For Lefebvre, the two things that, you know, he's such a beautiful and rich thinker in so many ways, and way beyond the politics of space or the production of space. I love that book, but the two things for this work that really captivated me about Lefebvre was possible and possible, but also this dialectic of the lived and the conceived, which you know, Kristen Ross mentions. Although Ross, I love her and I love her work, but I feel like the dialectic of the lived and conceived drops out of her work because she's got that strong sentence where she's like, imagination comes out of practices and not the other way around ever. And I am more interested in this circular relationship between the lived and the conceived, always interrupting and enabling and nourishing each other. I mean, that book is so beautiful and brilliant, but it's part of why I spend all that time on Marx's poetry from the future. You know, you talked, Robin told me that James talked about the three temporalities, and each of them could be, you know, are important. And one of the things that struck me, I didn't spend a lot of time flagging it here, but I am, you know, as trained in Marxism and taken by Marxism. I'm always a dialectical thinker. I'm always interested in the way in which new possibilities come from a contradictory present. And yet in this book, I open myself and also try to narrate the ways in which Marx is always a dialectical thinker, but there's a kind of, we need to, there's Marx who is always talking about this dialectical novelties that emerge from given arrangements, but he also has these moments where he says, the socialist revolution, he says the revolution of the 19th century has to draw its poetry from the future and the past, which is something like, you know, it's a paradoxical thing. And that there's a kind of invitation to something like political imagination, which comes through practices like the Paris Commune, but it's not, you know, there's a way in which even Marx is saying, like, let's imagine the impossible. And also in the stuff that Ross and Tomba talk about in terms of the Russian Commune, for example, he's also saying, look, these past formations that persist in an untimely present may open dialectical pathways to the future. So Marx himself, in ways that I think are underappreciated, is attentive to all three of these temporal moments in productive ways. And he's not sectarian he's not orthodox about that. He's like, you know, he also doesn't offer, you know, the caricatured Marxism I mentioned, has Marx as this blueprint buffer, and Marx is like constantly reading different historical situations to say, here we need to draw a portrait from the future. Here we need to see how the factory already is social property and social labor in incipient form. Here we have to look at how peasant production in early modern Europe, or how the Russian commune, these past practices may already be a form of socialism that just needs to be conjugated with the present. So I think that's also a useful thing, that even Marx is open to political imagination. I think I'd love to know what you guys who are close readers of Marx think about that.
But we have a cheap for that.
Sorry, Joey.
Well, Gary, thank you. As usual, you've got my head spinning with the richness of your analysis and of the balls you get into the air, and the breadth and depth of your reading. And I want to, while recognizing and honoring that, I also want to try to move us outside of what I take to be the universe that we've been in so far. And again, I haven't read the book, so I could be wrong about that. I've been thinking on the question of timescales, and I've been thinking about a couple of historical phenomena that I wasn't thinking about in the 1980s, but that I'm now thinking about, and I think everybody's thinking about. And that's what we bundle up under this word Anthropocene, which is a whole series of multiple temporalities, but understood at a planetary scale, and at a planetary scale that precedes capitalism, the history of capitalism, and precedes the history of modernity, as we usually understand it, and precedes, and which is outside in some ways the domain that we've been in so far, which is the Black Atlantic, the North Atlantic, Europe and the North Atlantic. That's where almost everything we've been talking about comes from so far. And the planet, of course, is a lot more places. A new spirit of vandalism at least opens up the idea of what used to be third world. I mean, all those other places with their own histories coming into a fractured and articulated modernity. Okay, that's, I think, the other time frame along from the Anthropocene is that I wasn't thinking about then and I am now, is bundles under the word indigeneity. Marx has started out very good at talking about the indigenous, or what we now call indigeneity. Even the most simple Marxists like Stuart Hall has got a blind spot on that one. And now it's come into view. Everyone will mention it, and mention indigenous politics now when they're going down their checklist of social phenomena that need to be taken into account, and without reducing the indigenous to, minority politics or some other version of, or to Black politics, because the tension of Black and indigenous is not something that brushed aside when you think about the Cherokee freedmen, for example, and the indigenous people who were slaveholders. Building alliances is a complicated set of different histories, for sure. Something certainly would want to do. So multiple temporalities in these areas. These are two areas which I think are very global. My own access to the indigenous comes strongly from the island Pacific, a part of the world that has 1/4 of the world's languages. 1/4 of the world's languages in the island Pacific. In that respect, not a small place, but a place of a tiny dots of islands that people tend not to notice, but which is knitting itself together now in complicated old and new ways. And the indigenous is a textbook example of this idea of taking something from a past that had been apparently forgotten or disappeared, and now in a complex temporality of the present takes on new life. That's the indigeneity is all about drawing on something old in order to go somewhere not previously imagined.
Right.
And in ways that we all know, ways of thinking about how to deal with the problems that climate change and the ecological crisis present us, indigenous people have a lot of tools there, and they're now often invoked, often superficially, but nonetheless importantly. So this is a whole set of both, residual and emergent and kind of processes that I've been trying to think through and make it articulate, by which I mean not merge, but connect with the discourses of the Black Atlantic. Lisson is one of the more accessible crossover people. You'll find actually indigenous theorists citing Lisson more than, say, Du Bois or various others, or Stuart Hall or Paul Gilroy, or a lot of really great thinkers. So this is a kind of an area that I think I'd like to bring into view. And I would only say this last quick comment to Banu's question about the longer history of abstract utopianism. My initial critique, and this will bring it back to the indigenous, and probably to the Anthropocene. My introduction to that was to unthinking that tradition of utopianism was from Ursula K. Le Guin. And I don't know if you're familiar with her great essay on utopia, which has a name, it's called a Yin Utopia for a Cold California, or something like that, from the 1980s, written at the height of second wave feminism. And she, of course, science fiction, you said Marxism with imagination. Well, Fred Jameson gets some real points there, because he really takes science fiction seriously. And as we all should. As Donna Haraway endlessly reminds me, I should. But Ursula Le Guin's Utopia essay, she pictures the utopist, as she calls him, as a male figure who's kind of got a sense of the future, and we're all going there, whether we like it or not. And her view was that the utopist is a guy on a motorcycle. And she's riding into the future. And at one point she sort of says, the utopist would be well to get off the bike, put on a funny hat, bark 3 times, and trot off into the digger pines. In other words, instead of going this way to the future, go this way. Her utopia is along the lines I think you are into, which is, it's not in the future, it's here, but it's in the shadow. She says, we need to stop thinking of this radiant sandcastle, she says, which we can see in the bright light, in our bright light of enlightenment and reason and radical philosophy and everything like that. And we need to cultivate peripheral vision. She says, in the shadow, what's happening in the shadows? And so her vision of utopia is, again, it's not in the future, it's happening now. It leads to the alternate futures. So that's her. And the fact that the utopist turns essentially into coyote is, this is happening within a native Californian epistemology she grew up with as a child of an anthropologist and deeply influenced by native California. So the indigenous is part of her sense, and the fact that the utopist turns into an animal gets us into the interspecies world of theorizing about the Anthropocene. So she was into it in 1980, and but I think for me that sort of and I didn't read it back then, of course, but I'm ready for it now, and I think it for me that's a kind of what a sort of a next assignment. But so that was a ramble.
No.
I got 3 points, but it was basically trying to sort of broaden the perspective. I don't think it abandons your perspective at all. It builds on it, I hope, or at least adds to it.
Sure. We have 15 minutes, maybe.
Collect.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure, everyone gets to talk, yeah.
Yeah, so I have 2 questions. The first one is historical, the second one is more contemporary. So I'm glad that Banu and Jim already addressed these issues of the historical utopianism. And I think you addressed that quite sufficiently as well for me, because I am imagining a new book project on the history of idea of utopia in the 20th century China. So anyway, so that question I'm going to set it aside. I'm going to think about the more contemporary questions, especially the way you talk about configurations or exits of differentiations. I wish, and I'm not saying that you should, right? I wish people on the left could engage more about the rise of China today. The reason the reason I say that is because, well, I never lived in China, and I'm not a Chinese nationalist. And I studied China, though. I spent most of my adult life in North America, and I didn't really see a lot of what China looked like firsthand. I went to China for conferences and researches, but until 2019, I went to China for the longest trip I've ever had, which is about 1 month. I went to the southern China, and I made my way all the way to northern China, right before pandemic. So that shocked me, actually. So I started devouring the literature on the rise of China, and to my surprise, and I consider myself internationalist and, sort of on the left. And to my surprise, I couldn't find much discourse or writing or discussions on the rise of China. Chris can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but so I could only find a lot of stuff on the policy discussion, international theorists, and even the American government, right? And I think, as far as I can see, this past 3 years is the beginning of a lot of things, a lot of ends. De-dollarization is one. What? De-dollarization.
De-dollarization.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I've been following that, and the formation of the new Sino-Russian alliance will be the second one. When we say a lot of theorists and people would argue this is the rise of the West, but I think that's too general, because really it's the rise of China, and the rest sort of follow along with the largest manufacturers of the world. So, there are a lot of imaginations in China today about the future. How a different world would look like if the West is no longer the dominant power of culture in the world today. That kind of thinking should be quite relevant, and we should engage more. I just wish we had more of that. And so I'd like to run that by you guys.
I add one very short comment. It's really short. About the awakening. Again, let's go back to Benjamin for a second, the awakening moment. So there is something that Benjamin and many others actually usually cite about this element of awakening. And it's an old fragment by Heraclitus. Heraclitus wrote that when we Heraclitus.
In English, Heraclitus.
Heraclitus.
They have to vulgarize it, make it the vowel sounding, bomb cells, Heraclitus.
Heraclitus. Heraclitus. And so the fragment goes like this. When we dream, when we are sleeping, we live in our private world. When we are awake, we have a common world. So, and there is always a tension between the private world in which everybody can live in your dreams and the common. The point is how you provide the common. What is the common? So the question is that in a certain way, your utopianism is the common. How can the
dream be the common?
How can we be awake from our private worlds, from the present in which everything is extremely fragmented? So in a certain way, I would say one of the dangers, and the left contributed to that, is the extreme fragmentations of the present. Benjamin Heraclitus went in the different direction. It's how we can provide a common world. I think this is the most difficult question, and I think it's not by chance that we are stuck in the same question, at least in the Western tradition for 2,500 years. And I think there's an easy answer to say, oh, we live in a common world and we share something, we have something in common because we all see the danger of climate change. I'm not denying that climate change is a danger, but it cannot be the substance of this common being, because otherwise it requires just technical solutions and not political. If we have to think the common politically, the utopianism, we also have to be ready to accept that we disagree, there are conflicts, there are tensions, and we cannot easily say, oh, those who don't see the danger of the climate change are just idiots or manipulated. This is a way to depoliticize the entire question of the common. So the point is, what you call utopianism is basically the possible, impossible common. That is the dimension of politics, but the dimension in which the common is always full of tension and possible conflict. And there is no more.
Okay, let me go around the horn in an inadequate way. This is small groups, sometimes the best discussion. This is fantastic, and we could go on and on. I like that. I agree about the common, and Glisson, back to Glisson, has this idea. Remember that sentence where he says, which I love, I don't need to understand the person I am in solidarity with. Like this idea that we have to understand, and then we have to find commonality, and then it's a we, and that's part of what you're talking about, the common or the we that is a non-identical we, a non-homogeneous we, a non-consensual we, an agonistic we, kind of messy and differentiated we. Hopefully, by endlessly fighting to minimize, the question always is, does difference mean hierarchy? Can there be difference without inequality, without asymmetry? And the progressive position is always arguing for difference and arguing against difference. And so I'm with you there. I would flip around the common sense about the dream private, common public, and maybe part of what I'm suggesting, I've never thought about this before, and that I know. Heraclitus is who we always go back to, like, no, dialectics were already there, right? Heidegger and Hegel go back to Heraclitus, and that already dialectical thinking was there, the becoming, right? He's the thinker of the becoming, right? So I don't know this fragment, but I guess I would think, what if, I think what I'm suggesting is that this long-standing and correct, well-grounded skepticism towards idealism and utopianism is partly about, well, all that dreaming is private and individual and liberal and personal and subjective. But I guess I'm suggesting that the dream world, which we often think of as private and cut off, may provide crucial resources for what you're calling the common. And if we're going to go in the direction you're thinking, let's get away from this idea that dream, private, individual, waking is, like, let's wake up to the dream world that is not private. Or Proust goes into, Benjamin says, Proust is, we don't like his politics, but he goes into the dream world to understand the truth of the waking world in a way that we on the left might learn from. So I'm with you about building a common, and perhaps a messy common that is not homogeneous may require more attention to the dream world than the left has accorded for a long time, despite the understandable ways in which the left is suspicious of psychoanalysis, of Freud, of fantasy, of utopianism, and that's the Ursula Le Guin thing. I'll come back to that. So anyway, to be continued. Left in China. I think the left in China is the question of China is a crucial question for the left today. And, David Harvey has been writing a lot. Go to the podcast, go to the YouTube videos, go to some of his recent writings. You may not be satisfied, but certainly at CUNY Graduate Center, this question of China is really alive. Vijay Prashad also is, talking a lot about China. And I have mixed feelings, partly because I don't know anything about China. I read the newspaper, partly because, I'm a, CLR James kind of critic of state capitalism. I see China as, I'm an anti-Soviet believer in the state capitalism thesis. And Samir Amin, too, also had this critique of state capitalism, critique of the Soviet Union as a form of state capitalism, whether he uses that language or not. So to me, I see China as a form of state capitalism that is not necessarily identical with Western capitalism at all. I think the future is China's. I think, and I think the left has to decide on this. I think so many people on the left, including this debate we're having at the Graduate Center, is almost taking up because of the liberal and American demonization of China, there's almost this acceptance that, like, okay, well, then we stand with China on the left and as a left project. And I think that is precisely going back to the imperial war rather than the civil war and the kind of extractive productivism and statism that I think, but I don't know enough. That's what people say. Well, you don't know, that is embodied or practiced by China is not the democratic socialism that I want to struggle for. The future that China is imagining is not the other. It is another possible world. It's not the one I think I want to struggle for, but maybe I don't know enough. There's a very spirited, because there is the language of alleviating poverty. But to me, what's happening in China is like a high modernist, catch up and exceed geopolitical vision of, it is certainly an alternative to a Western-centric world. But this is an open question. I don't want to hold forth, but we do have these debates because there are a lot of people at my institution who are really captivated by China. Of like, okay, you say you want socialism, here it is. There is still a Chinese Communist Party. It is, in this new moment, there's even a move to Lenin, and it's a Leninist moment. And I don't know. That's not the socialism that I think I want, and I think that it depresses me, frankly, to see so many leftists I admire be captivated by China. But of course, and then they say you're just playing into this Western, bullshit discourse of it. I'm not I'm anti-authoritarian. I think this is archism. I don't know what we all.
As a China person, I'd say that the people that of whom you speak, the champions of China on the U.S. left, are the ignorant ones about China. I don't know anyone.
That's so helpful to hear.
No, I actually don't know anyone who's a China specialist. I mean, my comrades on the left and who work in China and on China, I think they spend too much time fighting with those people because they're mostly idiots. I will say that.
Or idiots on the question of China.
Yeah.
David Hart is not an idiot.
Well, he's not a champion of China. I mean, he doesn't think that China is an alternative. I mean, I think
more and more
I think
there's a sympathy, there's a deep sympathy there.
Well, and Vijay Prasad, who wore a mask saying, "I love zero COVID." I mean, this regime.
Yeah.
That's kind of uncomfortable. And also Samir Amin, who, towards the end of his life, I mean, it was sort of, it was what was called in some circles the anti-imperialism of idiots, which says the enemy of my enemy, is my
exactly.
friend. But he was quite a champion of Chinese capitalism, like towards the very end of his life. And in Monthly Review and in other places, he was pushing that line. And it's like,
I know early on Maoism was extremely important in an explicit way. I didn't know that about the end of his life.
I mean, he actually, in delinking, he made a genuine political case for a sort of third worldist deglobalization. Yes. But by the end of his life, it was China that was charting a way forward that was outside of American capitalism. So for him, it was really, U.S. capitalism that was the stand-in for capitalism as a form, as a social form. And I thought that was a huge regression on his part.
And I think this idea that somehow, I mean, we all want to see this, the de-dollarization, the demise of the West, like enough already. I am not going to mourn the end of the West, but this fantasy that somehow, if it's a geopolitical difference, like if it's not the West, then it's progressive or emancipatory or socialist. I'm not sympathetic. I think that is precisely what the people I'm inspired by warn us against. I don't think that's the way forward. So maybe.
Very quick comments that Samir Amin was frequently cited by a lot of the Chinese communists I read. Economists I read. So that I am most unhappy about is how a lot of people explain the rise of China. It's not like looking at the future, but why did China rise so fast and so sudden and come as a surprise?
We should have started with your question. You should have said, I'm leaving. I want to talk about the monetary, and I want to see the initiatives. Okay, I'm so sorry, Jay. Thank you. Thank you for your questions. I got it. I hear you. I hear the questions, and I have.
I've already dreamed all of your answers. They're really all right.
All right, I should have started with you.
Karen, have you ever read?
No, I should have said, but I forgot what time.
Okay, take care. Thank you. Thank you for coming in. Very wonderful questions.
Have you read The Dawn of Everything?
Not yet.
You should read it because I keep thinking of that. And that book blew my mind. Everybody should read it, by the way. And in 30 seconds, the main argument is that all of these kind of utopian solutions that we have already existed throughout human history. And there's been this kind of like, kind of collective plot to sort of
very in some ways.
Have you read it?
I read it.
Oh,
yeah.
There's been this kind of like collective plot to read all these things as leading up to archism, but they're not. There's a million varieties that have already. So it's really. So I mean, it turns the past into like already been these utopias, and it made me feel hopeful about the world for the first time. If we survive all this giant mess, we'll probably revert
to our natural, like a bigger time scale that Jim was talking about, maybe what upper more hope approach was less.
Exactly.
Interesting. Okay, we can leave.
Yeah.
Thank you guys. Sorry about it.